Jazz McKinnon found the injured black mail-order bride trapped beneath the overturned wagon after the tornado passed, her fine dress torn and muddy against the splintered wood. The storm had carved a path of destruction across the Montana Territory, leaving debris scattered like broken promises across the prairie. He dismounted his horse and knelt beside the unconscious woman, checking for signs of life. Her breathing came shallow but steady. A crumpled letter clutched in her pale palm bore the careful script of correspondence between strangers planning a life together. The wagon's contents lay strewn across the torn earth. Scattered among the personal belongings were leather satchels that had burst open, revealing glass vials filled with dried herbs and strange metal instruments he had never seen before. Jazz lifted her carefully, noting the weight of her stillness. Blood matted her dark hair where debris had struck. Her face held an elegance that spoke of education, of a life lived in parlors rather than pastures. The mystery of her presence, here, in this devastated landscape, would have to wait. His horse moved steady beneath the double burden as they rode toward his ranch. The familiar outline of his cabin emerged from the settling dust, a small beacon against the endless sky. Inside, his daughter Clementine lay fevered in her narrow bed, her 8-year-old frame diminished by weeks of illness that had resisted every remedy the local doctor could provide. Jazz carried the stranger to the spare room and laid her on the bed with the same gentle care he used when moving his daughter during her worst spells. The woman's breathing had strengthened during the ride, and color had returned to her cheeks. He cleaned the wound on her head with practiced efficiency, having tended injuries on cattle drives and harsh winters. When he returned to check on Clementine, her fever had spiked again. Her small hand burned in his calloused palm. The doctor had been by yesterday, shaking his head with that particular expression of defeat that fathers learn to fear. Nothing more to be done, he had said. Let her rest and pray the fever breaks. The stranger stirred awake near evening, her eyes opening to take in the unfamiliar room with careful assessment. Jazz sat in the chair beside her bed, his hat resting on his knee. "You were hurt in the storm," he said quietly. "This is my ranch. You're safe here." She touched the bandage on her head, her movements precise despite her obvious discomfort. "My belongings? I brought what I could find. Your satchels are on the dresser." Her eyes moved quickly to the leather bags, and something like relief crossed her features. She tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against the pillow. "I'm Evangeline Thornfield," she said. "I was traveling to meet my intended husband." Jazz nodded toward the window where the destruction still scarred the landscape. The storm hit hard. "Haven't found many survivors yet." The implications settled between them without need for explanation. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they held a particular kind of emptiness that came from losing everything twice. "I'm Jazz McKinnon. This is my ranch. You're welcome to stay until you're well enough to travel." She studied his face with an intelligence that made him suddenly aware of his rough appearance, the dust still coating his clothes from the search for survivors. "You have a child," I heard coughing. "My daughter Clementine. She's been fighting a fever." Something shifted in Evangeline's expression. Her eyes moved again to the satchels, then back to his face. "How long has she been ill?" 3 weeks. "Doctor says there's nothing more he can do." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Jazz had noticed how expertly she had tended to her own wounds when she thought he wasn't watching. Her hands moved with the sureness of someone who understood the body's mysteries. "I might be able to help," she said quietly, then immediately looked away. "That is, I've picked up some knowledge over the years. Nothing professional, you understand." From Clementine's room came another fit of coughing, weak and desperate. Jazz felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with helplessness. He had lost his wife to childbed fever 2 years ago. The thought of losing Clementine to another ailment he couldn't fight left him hollow. "I'd be grateful for any help," he said. Evangeline sat up carefully, testing her strength. I'll need to examine her, and I'll need access to my supplies. Jazz retrieved the satchels and set them beside her bed. When she opened them, he caught glimpses of bottles filled with powders and roots, instruments that gleamed with careful maintenance, and small cloth bundles that gave off the scent of distant places. Where did you learn about medicine? He asked. She paused in her inventory, her hand stilling over a particular bottle. My grandmother was a healer. She taught me what she could. The way she said it carried weight beyond the simple words. Jazz had learned to recognize the careful language people used when their past contained more than they could safely share. I'll take you to see Clementine, he said. The storm had brought destruction, but it had also brought this mysterious woman with her hidden knowledge. As they walked toward his daughter's room, Jazz allowed himself the first stirring of hope he had felt in weeks. 3 days passed with Clementine burning from within. Her fever climbed beyond what the thermometer could measure, her small body shaking against the sweat-soaked sheets. Jazz pressed cool cloths to her forehead while Evangeline watched from the doorway, her hands gripping the frame until her knuckles went white. Dr. Marcus Henley arrived at dawn on the 4th day, his medical bag worn smooth from years of frontier practice. He examined Clementine with the thoroughness of a man who had seen too many children lost to prairie fevers. His instruments gleamed cold in the lamplight as he listened to her labored breathing. Her lungs are filling, he said finally, closing his bag with a decisive snap of finality. The fever's too high, too long. Jazz stood beside his daughter's bed, his hands useless at his sides. The doctor's words fell between them with the weight of stones dropped in still water. There must be something else, Jazz said. Dr. Henley shook his head. I've done everything medical science allows. Keep her comfortable. That's all we can do now. The doctor gathered his instruments and left them alone with the sound of Clementine's ragged breathing. Jazz sank into the chair beside her bed, his head in his hands. The morning light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes that danced above his dying daughter. Evangeline remained in the doorway, her body rigid with internal struggle. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years, speaking of willow bark and elder flower, of remedies that could break fevers when white medicine failed. She had watched her grandmother save children from the very edge of death, had learned the precise measurements and timing that meant the difference between healing and harm. But this was not the plantation where her grandmother had worked in secret, tending to the quarters when the master's doctor had given up. This was Montana territory, where women who knew too much about healing found themselves branded as witches or worse. Clementine's breathing grew shallower. A sound escaped her small throat that spoke of surrender. Jazz looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. I can't lose her too. The words hung in the air between them. Evangeline saw herself at 7 years old, watching her grandmother's hands work their careful magic. She saw herself at 15, grinding herbs by moonlight and memorizing the songs that carried the healing forward. She saw herself at 22, fleeing north with nothing but her grandmother's knowledge sewn into the lining of her traveling bag. She saw Clementine's face, fever-bright and fading. Evangeline pushed past Jazz and knelt beside the bed. Her hands moved to Clementine's forehead, feeling the dangerous heat that spoke of a body consuming itself. She had seen this fever before. She knew its hunger and its weakness. What are you doing? Jazz asked. Evangeline was already moving toward her satchels, her fingers finding the familiar bottles without needing to look. White willow bark ground to powder. Elder flower dried at the precise moment of potency. Chamomile harvested under the full moon. The knowledge flowed through her hands, generations of healing wisdom that had been passed down through whispered lessons and careful observation. She measured the powders with a precision that spoke of years of practice. The proportions had to be exact. Too little and the fever would rage on. Too much and the cure would become poison. Jazz watched her work, his eyes widening as he recognized the skill in her movements. This was not the fumbling of someone who had picked up knowledge here and there. This was the expertise of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding the body's mysteries. "Where did you really learn this?" he asked. Evangeline added hot water to the mixture, stirring it with a wooden spoon worn smooth by countless preparations. "My grandmother was a root doctor. She taught me everything she knew." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Jazz understood that root doctors were healers who worked outside the boundaries of conventional medicine, who carried knowledge that predated the white man's arrival in this territory. "Will it work?" he asked. Evangeline lifted Clementine's head and pressed the cup to her lips. The child's throat worked reflexively, swallowing the bitter medicine. "It should. But if anyone asks, you must say the fever broke on its own." The request hung between them, heavy with implications. Jazz nodded without hesitation. They waited. The wind outside spoke of coming weather, of changes moving across the vast prairie. Inside the cabin, time stretched thin as wire. Evangeline sat on one side of the bed, Jazz on the other, both watching for signs of improvement. An hour passed, then two. Clementine's breathing began to slow, to deepen. The terrible heat began to recede from her skin. By evening, her fever had broken completely. Jazz touched his daughter's forehead with trembling fingers. Cool skin met his palm. Clementine's eyes opened, clear and aware for the first time in days. "Papa," she whispered. Jazz gathered her in his arms, his shoulders shaking with relief. Over his daughter's head, he looked at Evangeline with an expression that held gratitude and something deeper. Something that recognized the enormity of what she had risked. "Thank you," he said quietly. Evangeline nodded and began gathering her supplies. Her hands shook slightly as she returned the bottles to their careful arrangement. She had revealed herself completely, had shown skills that marked her as dangerous in the eyes of those who feared what they could not understand. Outside, the wind carried the sound of approaching horses. Jazz moved to the window and saw his neighbor, Mrs. Clara Whitfield, dismounting near the porch. She had likely come to pay her respects, expecting to find a household in mourning. Instead, she would find a miracle. And miracles, Evangeline knew, were the most dangerous things of all. Mrs. Clara Whitfield had seen the impossible through the cabin window. A child given up for dead, now sitting up in bed, asking for water and porridge. The neighbor woman's eyes had moved from Clementine's healthy face to the strange bottles still scattered on the dresser, then to Evangeline's hands arranging them with practiced care. Word traveled fast in frontier country. By evening, the first desperate family arrived under cover of darkness. Henrik Olsen carried his twin boys, both burning with the same fever that had nearly claimed Clementine. His wife Astrid followed behind, her face carved hollow by sleepless nights and the certainty of loss. Jazz met them at the door, understanding immediately why they had come. The secret had wings now, flying from house to house on the wind of whispered hope. "Dr. Henley says there's nothing to be done," Henrik said. "But we heard about your daughter." Jazz looked back at Evangeline, who stood in the shadows of the main room. She had been pacing since sunset, her hands clasping and unclasping as she wrestled with the weight of what her actions had set in motion. "I can't promise anything," she said finally, but she took the children anyway, laying them on blankets by the fireplace. Her hands moved with the same careful precision she had used on Clementine, measuring and mixing while the parents watched with the intensity of people balancing on the edge of a cliff. The twins recovered by morning. Word spread further. Jazz found Evangeline at dawn, sitting on the porch steps with her knees drawn up, staring at the horizon where the sun painted the sky in shades of uncertainty. "You didn't come west to hide," he said, settling beside her. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust at her feet. "I came west to disappear." There's a difference. What were you disappearing from? The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of histories too dangerous to speak aloud. Evangeline's hands stilled in the dust. My grandmother was born in chains, she said finally. She learned healing from her mother, who learned it from hers. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who weren't allowed to call themselves doctors. Jazz understood the careful language of survival, the way people learn to speak around the edges of truth. She taught me everything she knew before she died. How to read the body's signals. How to match the cure to the sickness. How to work without the white doctors knowing. The morning wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from distant mountains. Evangeline pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. After the war, I went north to Chicago. Worked as a seamstress while I studied medical texts at night. But there were limits to what someone like me could do officially. So you answered a marriage advertisement. Thomas Whitmore wrote about wanting a wife who could help him establish a medical practice for frontier families. He said he believed healing belonged to anyone with the skill to do it, regardless of their background. Jazz heard the past tense. In her words, the careful way she spoke of dreams that had died in the storm. I thought I could start fresh here. Be a farmer's wife with a useful hobby. Keep my real knowledge buried. But children kept dying. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. 3 weeks I watched your daughter burn with fever. 3 weeks I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I had to protect myself first. You saved her. I broke my own rules. The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Sheriff Samuel Cross rode into the yard, his badge catching the morning light. Behind him rode a man Jazz recognized but had never spoken to directly. Cornelius Blackwood owned more land than anyone else in the territory, and his opinions carried weight in town. Sheriff Cross dismounted and approached the porch. His face held the careful neutrality of a man walking between opposing forces. "Morning, Jazz, Miss Thornfield." Jazz stood, his body automatically positioning itself between Evangeline and the visitors. "Sheriff, word is there's been some unusual healing going out here. Thought I should check on things." Blackwood remained mounted, his eyes moving over the cabin with the calculating gaze of a man who saw opportunity in others' difficulties. "Heard you've been harboring someone who practices unconventional medicine." "I've been hosting a woman who was injured in the storm," Jazz said evenly. "Woman who's been treating sick children with mysterious potions," Blackwood continued. "Some folks in town are getting concerned about that kind of activity." Evangeline stood slowly, her hand smoothing her skirt. "I've helped a few families." "Nothing more. Help them how exactly?" Blackwood asked. The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Jazz felt the tension coiling in the air between them, the careful dance of people who understood the consequences of saying too much. "With herbal remedies," Evangeline said. "Common knowledge passed down through generations. Common knowledge that saved children the town doctor couldn't help." Sheriff Cross shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure we need to make this into something bigger than it is, don't we?" Blackwood's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Strange woman appears after the storm. Suddenly children are being cured by methods no Christian doctor would recognize. Makes people nervous." Jazz felt his hands clench into fists. Those children would have died without her help. Maybe. Or maybe they would have recovered naturally. And now we've got folks thinking they need to seek out unusual remedies instead of trusting proper medicine. The accusation hung in the air, dangerous and sharp. Evangeline stepped forward, her chin raised in quiet defiance. "I've helped families who asked for help, nothing more. Hope that's all it is," Blackwood said. "Because this territory doesn't need the kind of trouble that comes from people practicing medicine without proper authority." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving dust and threat hanging in the morning air. Sheriff Cross lingered. his expression apologetic. "I'd be careful if I were you," he said quietly. "Blackwood's got influence in town. And folks get nervous about things they don't understand." After he left, Jazz and Evangeline stood alone on the porch, the weight of what had just happened settling around them. "I should leave," Evangeline said. "Where would you go?" She had no answer for that. The horizon stretched endless in all directions, empty of sanctuary. That evening, 3 more families arrived in the darkness, carrying children who burned with fever. Evangeline looked at Jazz across the cabin, her eyes asking a question she couldn't voice. Jazz nodded. She began preparing her medicines. Diphtheria struck Crow's Nest like a scythe through wheat. The disease moved from house to house with relentless hunger, stealing breath from the young and old alike. Dr. Henley's treatments failed, one after another, his medical bag becoming a collection of useless instruments against an enemy that laughed at conventional wisdom. The first child died on a Tuesday. Little Sarah Martinez, 7 years old, suffocated in her mother's arms, while the doctor stood helpless beside the bed. Her funeral drew half the town, their faces masks of grief and growing terror. By Thursday, 6 more children lay dying. Maria Santos arrived at Jazz's ranch after midnight, her daughter Alina limp in her arms. The child's breathing came in harsh, rattling gasps, her throat swollen nearly shut. Behind Maria came the Olsen family again, their youngest son now fighting the disease that had claimed his classmates. "Dr. Henley says there's nothing he can do," Maria whispered, her voice breaking. "Says we should prepare for the worst." Evangeline took Elena without hesitation. The child's skin burned with fever, her pulse rapid and thready beneath Evangeline's fingers. The disease had progressed far, but not beyond the reach of remedies that had been fighting such infections for generations. She worked through the night, grinding willow bark and elderflower, mixing tinctures that carried the concentrated wisdom of her grandmother's hands. The kitchen became her laboratory, filled with the sharp sense of healing herbs and the quiet desperation of parents watching their children hover between life and death. Elena's breathing eased by dawn. The swelling in her throat receded, and color returned to her cheeks. The Olsen boy followed the same path. Back from the edge of darkness, word spread faster than the disease itself. By the end of the week, a steady stream of families made the journey to the McKinnon Ranch. They came in the darkness, carrying children that conventional medicine had abandoned. Jazz turned none of them away, though he saw the strain growing in Evangeline's face with each new arrival. She saved them all. The success rate was impossible to ignore. While Dr. Henley's patients continued to die, every child who reached Evangeline's care recovered. The contrast drew attention from those who preferred their miracles to come from expected sources. Mayor Samuel Whitfield arrived on Sunday morning, his wife Clara beside him. Their son Jonathan lay unconscious in the back of their wagon, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his chest. Dr. Henley had given up on the boy the previous evening. "I know what people are saying about this place," the mayor said, his voice heavy with the weight of a father's desperation. "I don't care about politics right now. I just want my son to live." Clara Whitfield's eyes met Evangeline's across the wagon bed. Between them passed the understanding of mothers who had watched children suffer, who had learned that pride was a luxury they could not afford. "Help him," Clara said simply. Evangeline took the boy into her arms, feeling the familiar weight of a life balanced on the edge of leaving. Jonathan's pulse fluttered like a bird's wing, weak but persistent. The disease had progressed dangerously far, but something in the child's spirit spoke of a will to fight. She worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, adjusting her remedies. As the boy's condition shifted, Jazz brought her food she barely touched, watched her hands shake with exhaustion as she prepared yet another dose of medicine. "You're killing yourself," he said quietly. "He's the mayor's son," she replied, not looking up from her work. "If I lose him, everything changes." The weight of that truth settled between them. Jonathan Whitfield was not just another sick child. He was a test, a public trial of Evangeline's abilities under the scrutiny of the town's most powerful family. On the third day, the boy's fever broke. His breathing deepened, and his eyes opened clear and aware. He asked for water and his mother, simple requests that carried the force of miracles. Mayor Whitfield wept openly. His wife held her son with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had touched loss and been granted reprieve. "How can we repay you?" the mayor asked. "Just remember what you've seen here," Evangeline said. But gratitude was a complicated currency in a territory where fear and prejudice ran deeper than gold veins. Dr. Henley arrived the next morning, his face dark with humiliation and growing anger. He examined Jonathan with the thorough intensity of a man looking for evidence of deception. "What exactly did you give him?" he demanded. "Herbal remedies," Evangeline replied. "Traditional preparations." "Traditional according to whom? What medical school taught you these methods?" The question hung sharp in the air between them. Jazz stepped closer to Evangeline, his body language speaking of protection and loyalty. "Does it matter where she learned it?" Jazz asked. "The boy is alive. It matters because people are starting to think she can do things I can't," Dr. Henley said. "That's dangerous thinking." "Why is it dangerous?" Mayor Whitfield asked. "Because it's true." The words cut deep. Dr. Henley's face flushed with wounded pride and professional embarrassment. He had studied at medical colleges, had certificates and degrees that validated his authority. Yet this woman with her mysterious knowledge was accomplishing what his education could not. "People need to understand the difference between legitimate medicine and folk superstition," he said. "Just because something works doesn't mean it's right." "My son was dying," the mayor said flatly. "Now he's not. That's the only right I care about." Dr. Henley left without another word, but his anger lingered in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire. That evening, Cornelius Blackwood returned to the ranch. This time he brought more men, their faces hard with the particular righteousness of those who had found an enemy to focus their fears upon. "This has gone far enough," Blackwood announced. "You're undermining the proper order of things, making people think they don't need real doctors." "I'm helping sick children," Evangeline said. "You're practicing medicine without authority, filling people's heads with dangerous ideas about healing." Jazz stood beside Evangeline, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. "She's saved more lives in the past 2 weeks than the town doctor has in the past year," he said. "That's exactly the problem," Blackwood replied. "People are starting to prefer her methods to proper medicine. That kind of thinking leads to chaos." The threat was clear now, no longer hidden behind careful words. Evangeline felt the familiar weight of persecution, the particular danger that came from being too successful at something others believed she had no right to do. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to stop practicing medicine. Leave that to qualified professionals. And if I refuse?" Blackwood's smile held no warmth. "Then we'll find other ways to restore proper order to this community." After they left, Jazz and Evangeline stood alone in the gathering dusk. The horizon stretched away in all directions, vast and empty, offering no sanctuary from the storm that was building around them. "They're going to try to stop me," Evangeline sighed. "Let them try," Jazz replied. But they both knew that determination alone might not be enough against men who had the power to shape opinion and manipulate fear. Dr. Henley came to Blackwood's ranch like a man carrying poison in his blood. His medical bag sat heavy in his hands, weighted with the instruments of a profession that had been made to look foolish by a woman who should not have possessed such knowledge. "She's making me look incompetent," he said, setting the bag down with deliberate care. "Patients are asking why I can't do what she does." Blackwood poured whiskey into 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. What exactly is she? Doing that you can't? Saving children, I've declared hopeless. Using methods that have no basis in proper medical training. The words carried the bitterness of a man whose authority had been undermined by someone he considered fundamentally unqualified. Dr. Henley had spent years studying anatomy and pharmacology, had certificates that validated his expertise. Yet families were choosing mysterious herbal remedies over his trained judgment. How is that possible? Blackwood asked. She's experimenting on these children, using them to test dangerous concoctions. The fact that some of them recover is pure luck. The lie formed easily, shaped by wounded pride and professional jealousy. Dr. Henley convinced himself it was true even as he spoke it. The alternative was admitting that his education had left him inferior to a woman who carried her knowledge in leather satchels and spoke in the careful language of the dispossessed. That's a serious accusation, Blackwood said. It's the only explanation that makes sense. She's gambling with children's lives, and when her experiments succeed, people call it miraculous healing. Blackwood nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications. If that's true, the community needs to know. Parents have a right to understand what's really happening to their children. Exactly. We need to expose her methods before someone gets hurt. The conspiracy took shape between them, built on half-truths and deliberate misunderstanding. Dr. Henley would provide the medical authority to challenge Evangeline's methods. Blackwood would use his influence to shape public opinion. Neither man acknowledged the deeper truth driving their actions. This was about power, about maintaining the established order in a territory where such order was fragile and constantly threatened. The plan began the next morning. Dr. Henley made his rounds through town, visiting the families whose children had been treated by Evangeline. He spoke with the careful authority of a concerned physician, raising questions about the mysterious remedies their children had received. I'm not questioning the results, he told Maria Santos as she prepared breakfast for Elena, now fully recovered from diphtheria. I'm concerned about the methods. Do you know what substances she gave your daughter? Maria's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Herbal medicine. Traditional remedies. Traditional according to whom? What if those substances had dangerous side effects? What if the next child isn't so lucky? The seeds of doubt, carefully planted. Dr. Henley repeated the conversation throughout the town, using his medical credentials to cast suspicion on methods that had succeeded where his own had failed. Meanwhile, Blackwood spoke to the men who gathered at the general store and the saloon. His approach was different, but equally effective. I'm not against helping sick children, he said. But we need to ask ourselves what kind of precedent we're setting. Are we going to let anyone practice medicine just because they claim to have special knowledge? The questions resonated with men who valued order and clear authority. The frontier was dangerous enough without adding uncertainty about who could be trusted with matters of life and death. What are you suggesting? Asked Henrik Olsen, whose twin boys had been saved by Evangeline's intervention. I'm suggesting we need to be careful about who we allow to treat our families. There are reasons why doctors require proper training and certification. The campaign gained momentum through the week. Whispered conversations in the mercantile. Concerned discussions after church services. The careful erosion of trust through questions that seemed reasonable on the surface. Some families remained loyal to Evangeline. They had watched their children recover from conditions that conventional medicine couldn't touch. But others began to waver, influenced by the persistent suggestion that they had unknowingly exposed their children to dangerous experiments. Jazz saw the change in the way people looked at Evangeline when they came to town for supplies. The grateful smiles had been replaced by uncertain glances and hurried conversations that stopped when she approached. They're turning against you, he said as they drove home from the mercantile. I know. Evangeline's voice carried the weariness of someone who had faced such campaigns before. It's easier to destroy trust than to build it. What do? We keep helping people who ask for help. And we prepare for things to get worse. The crisis came on a Thursday evening. Jazz had ridden to the south pasture to check on cattle when 3 men approached the ranch house. Evangeline was in the garden, gathering herbs by lamplight, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She recognized 2 of Blackwood's men, their faces hard with purpose. The third was a stranger, his clothes marking him as someone from outside the territory. "Miss Thornfield," the stranger called. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Hayes. I need to speak with you about your medical activities." Evangeline set down her basket and walked toward the men, her movements careful and deliberate. "What about them?" "There have been complaints. Allegations. That you're practicing medicine without proper authority. I've been helping families with herbal remedies, nothing more." "That's not what we've heard. We've got testimony that you've been conducting medical experiments on children." The accusation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Evangeline understood immediately what had happened. Her success had been reframed as reckless endangerment, her knowledge transformed into dangerous quackery. "That's not true," she said. "Maybe not. But there's enough concern that we need to investigate. Where's the child who lives here?" The question sent ice through Evangeline's veins. "Why do you want to know? We need to examine her. Make sure she hasn't been harmed by whatever treatments you've been giving her." Evangeline's mind raced. Clementine was inside, healthy and happy, doing her evening lessons. But if these men took her away for examination, if they convinced a judge that she had been subjected to dangerous treatments, the consequences would be devastating. "She's not here," Evangeline said. "Where is she?" "Visiting friends in town." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The deputy marshal studied her face, looking for signs of deception. "We'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Make sure the child is available for examination." After they left, Evangeline sat on the porch steps, her hands shaking with the realization of how completely her world had shifted. The families she had helped were now being told they should fear her. The children she had saved were being portrayed as victims of her reckless experiments. When Jazz returned from the pasture, he found her staring at the horizon where the last light was fading from the sky. "They're going to take Clementine," she said without looking at him. "What?" She told him about the deputy marshal, about the accusations, and the demand to examine his daughter. Jazz listened in silence, his face growing harder with each word. "They can't do that," he said finally. "They can if they convince a judge that I've been endangering her welfare." The truth of their situation settled around them with the weight of approaching storm clouds. Evangeline had saved dozens of children, but now those very successes were being used as weapons against her. "We could run," Jazz said. "Take Clementine and head for California." "Run where?" "This will follow us wherever we go." They sat in silence. As the stars emerged overhead, each lost in the contemplation of choices that carried impossible consequences. The night wind carried the scent of rain and the promise of changes that could not be avoided. "There's something else," Evangeline sighed quietly. "Something I haven't told you." Jazz waited, recognizing the weight of confession in her voice. The deputy marshal had a piece of paper. "An official document. I saw it when he reached for his badge." "What kind of document?" "A warrant. They're not just investigating my medical activities." The implication hung between them, heavy with the knowledge that their enemies had moved beyond mere intimidation. "They're going to arrest me," Evangeline said. Dawn came too early and too bright. Jazz found Clementine's bed empty, her blanket still warm, but the child gone. Her favorite doll lay abandoned on the floor, and the window that faced the east pasture stood open to the morning air. He called her name through the house, his voice echoing in rooms that felt suddenly hollow. Evangeline appeared in the doorway, her face already understanding the shape of their catastrophe. "They took her," Jazz said. The words fell between them with the weight of stones dropped in deep water. Outside, the morning carried the sound of distant horses and the particular silence that followed the completion of carefully planned actions. A piece of paper was nailed to the porch post, the official letterhead of the Territorial Marshal's office stark against the weathered wood. The message was brief and formal. Clementine McKinnon had been taken into protective custody pending investigation of her medical treatment. Evangeline Thornfield was to surrender herself for questioning regarding unlawful medical practices. "If you attempt to leave the territory, the child will be relocated beyond your reach," Jazz read aloud. "Present yourself at the marshal's office by noon or face additional charges." Evangeline sank into the porch chair, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had reached the end of available choices. The morning sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and indifferent to the destruction of human hopes. "I have to go," she said. "We'll figure something else out." "What else is there? They have Clementine. They have the legal authority to keep her." Jazz sat beside her, his hands useless on his knees. The ranch stretched around them, the land he had worked for years to build into something permanent and secure. All of it meaningless now against the power of men who could reshape truth into weapons. "There might be another way," Evangeline said quietly. She stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking toward the town where smoke rose from breakfast. Fires and the ordinary business of morning continued unchanged. Somewhere in that collection of buildings, families were waking up to children who breathed easily because of her intervention. "I'm going to town," she said, "but not to surrender." "What are you planning?" "To tell the truth, all of it. Let the community decide what they believe." The idea was either brilliant or suicidal. Jazz couldn't tell which. But he saw the determination in her posture, the way she held herself against the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. "I'm coming with you," he said. They rode toward Crow's Nest as the sun climbed higher, casting short shadows on the prairie grass. The town appeared ahead of them, the church steeple and mercantile roof cutting sharp lines against the pale sky. Neither spoke during the journey, both understanding that they were riding toward something that would change everything. The town square was already filled with people when they arrived. Word had spread about the marshal's actions, about the accusations against Evangeline and the protective custody of the McKinnon child. The crowd carried the tension of a community forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Blackwood stood on the steps of the general store, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to shaping public opinion. "We have to protect our families from dangerous medical experiments. That's what this is about." Dr. Henley nodded beside him, his medical bag clutched in his hands. "Professional standards exist for good reasons. We can't allow untrained individuals to practice medicine on our children." Evangeline dismounted and walked toward the crowd, her movements steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Jazz followed, his hand resting on his gun, but his posture speaking of protection rather than threat. "You want to know the truth about my medical practices?" Evangeline said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Ask the families whose children I've treated." The crowd shifted, uncertain. Some faces showed hostility, others curiosity. A few carried the particular expression of people who owed debts they weren't sure they wanted to acknowledge. "Maria Santos," Evangeline called. "Tell them about Elena." Maria stood at the edge of the crowd, her daughter beside her. The woman's face showed the conflict of someone torn between gratitude and fear. Elena was dying of diphtheria. The doctor said there was nothing he could do. And now? Now she's healthy. But maybe she would have recovered anyway. The doubt in Maria's voice cut deep. Evangeline understood the pressure that had been applied, the careful erosion of certainty that had turned gratitude into suspicion. "Henrik Olsen," Evangeline continued. Your twin boys were burning with fever when you brought them to me. Henrik stepped forward, his face troubled. They were sick. You gave them something, and they got better. What did I give them? I don't know. Some kind of herbal mixture. Willow bark for the fever. Elderflower for the infection. Chamomile to calm their systems. Remedies that have been used for generations. Dr. Henley stepped forward. Remedies that have no basis in modern medical science. Dangerous concoctions that could have killed those children. But they didn't die, said a voice from the crowd. Clara Whitfield pushed through the gathering, her face set with the determination of a mother who had faced loss and been granted reprieve. My son was dying. You declared him hopeless, Dr. Henley. She saved him. Mrs. Whitfield, you're understandably grateful, but you need to understand the risks involved. I understand that my son is alive. More voices joined hers. Parents stepping forward despite the pressure to remain silent. The Olsen family, moving to stand beside Evangeline. The Santos family, Maria's doubt replaced by the simple truth of her daughter's recovery. She saved my boys when you couldn't, Henrik said to Dr. Henley. That's not an experiment. That's a miracle. The crowd began to shift, the careful narrative of dangerous experimentation crumbling under the weight of lived experience. Blackwood's face darkened as he realized his campaign was collapsing. This is exactly what I warned against, he said. You're choosing superstition over science. I'm choosing what works, Clara Whitfield replied. My son is proof of what works. The marshal stepped forward, his badge catching the sunlight. This is all very touching, but we have legal obligations here. Miss Thornfield is accused of practicing medicine without proper authority. What authority do you need to save a child's life? Asked Reverend Stone, his voice carrying the weight of moral conviction. The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Around the square, faces showed the recognition that they were confronting something larger than local politics or professional jealousy. I have a letter, Reverend Stone continued, reaching into his coat pocket. From Thomas Whitmore, the man Miss Thornfield was to marry. He wrote to me before the storm, explaining his dream of establishing a medical practice that would serve everyone in this territory, regardless of their background. He unfolded the paper and read aloud. I seek a wife who shares my belief that healing belongs to anyone with the skill and calling to practice it. Miss Thornfield's knowledge represents the kind of medicine this frontier needs. The words carried the weight of testimony from beyond the grave. Thomas Whitmore's vision, spoken through his intended bride's actions, had become reality in ways he could never have imagined. Mayor Whitfield stepped forward. By the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I hereby grant Miss Evangeline Thornfield official recognition as a licensed medical practitioner in Crow's Nest. The declaration struck the crowd like thunder. Dr. Henley's face went pale with shock and rage. Blackwood's campaign had not just failed, but had resulted in the official validation of everything he had tried to prevent. Furthermore, the mayor continued, I call upon the territorial governor to investigate the circumstances surrounding the unlawful detention of Clementine McKinnon. Within an hour, Clementine was returned to her father's arms, the protective custody order dismissed as quickly as it had been issued. The marshal, faced with a community that had decisively rejected his authority, departed for the territorial capital with promises of investigation and reform. 6 months later, Evangeline treated patients of all backgrounds in her official clinic, while Jazz managed their expanded ranch. Clementine, healthy and strong, helped her new mother prepare medicines and learn the healing songs that had been passed down through generations of women who knew the secrets of life and death. The wedding had been held in the town square, officiated by Reverend Stone and attended by every family whose children had been touched by Evangeline's gift. Dr. Henley had left the territory the week before, his practice dissolved and his reputation destroyed by his own jealousy and deception. The frontier had proven itself capable of change, of recognizing truth even when it came in unexpected forms. And in a small town in Montana Territory, healing flowed through hands that carried the wisdom of generations, bridging the gap between what was and what could be. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.